Hello and welcome to the 11th Cloudscape Dev Log. It's been a while since the last devlog, but that's only because I've been working almost every single day on the game's development. What I have up on my screen right now is my GitHub commit changes since the end of the Kickstarter campaign. The list can be a bit deceptive, however, because some of these changes are minor and others are pretty massive, so one line in this list could either have taken 30 minutes or 30 hours. With that said, I'm going to break up this devlog into two parts, as it's just a lot for me to cover in a single video. So in this video, I'll walk you through a few significant changes I've made to the game since the previous video. Speaking of the previous video, I mentioned at the end of that video that I would talk about bug catching in the next devlog, so I guess that's as good a place to start as any. Bug catching has been added to the game, albeit in a very minimal way for now. I've set up the overall system for it, however I've only implemented one bug so far, which is the Firefly. The first thing I did was set up a scriptable object for creatures. This creature object effectively covers not only insects, but other creatures such as frogs, lizards, squirrels, birds, and more. As of now, it's got a handful of different variables included to help define each creature. In the case of the Firefly, I have the type set to flying insect, I have the movement set to fly around, and I've set the sprite for the Firefly and also the item you get when catching it, which is, to no surprise, a Firefly. I've also added a couple of more specific values, including a glow and lifespan value. The glow basically points to yet another scriptable object, simply titled glow. Inside of that object are just a handful of variables that define the glow, such as color, radius, and whether it blinks and how often it blinks. Once I set up the Firefly, including making the sprites, icon, and animation frames necessary, I then went about creating a creature spawner script. This script looks at the season and the time of day to determine when to spawn creatures into the environment. I can define exactly what creatures can spawn in any particular area of the game as well. So the spawner looks at the list of available creatures, determines if that creature fits all of the necessary conditions, and if it does, it then spawns the creature into the world. So as of right now, the Firefly will only spawn at night and has a short lifespan where it will fly around the environment. When the lifespan timer ends, the Firefly will fly off into the sky and leave the environment. So with that working well, the next step was to create the bug catching net. This was a fairly straightforward process, as I only needed to create the icon for the item and the sprite sheet for the bug net being used. I recycled my overhand tool swinging animation and just inserted the net sprite into that. So now when the player equips the net and uses the tool button, the net swinging animation plays. I then do a simple check as the net hits the ground to see if an insect is within a close enough distance to be caught. If so, remove the insect from the environment and place the insect's item into the player's hands. At this point, I have a system where bugs can spawn and the player can catch them. There's still more to do with bug catching, such as adding the ability for the player to hold the tool button to sneak around slowly, making the insects react to movement and sound so they escape when frightened, and of course adding a lot more insects to the environment overall. But I felt like I accomplished adding the feature to the game, and as I usually do, I jumped on over to another task. I added a whole lot of sounds and more music to the game overall, including various sounds for the globs that you battle. Speaking of battling, I've also added a cross-fading audio system into the game which works to transition the normal game music to battle music when monsters get too close. I'm going to include an option to toggle this battle music on or off because I know some people may get tired of having the music transition so frequently. Aside from adding a bunch of other sounds to the game, I made a lot of general fixes and adjustments to many aspects of the game, though this video would be 3 hours long if I sat here listing off all of the minor changes, so I'll just say that it was a lot, and now we can move on to talking about fishing. So with fishing, I knew early on that I wanted to take a more realistic approach and avoid turning it into too much of a minigame situation, but I also didn't want to take away all challenge by having a system where you just cast out your line and press a button one time to catch a fish. The design I ended up with works like this. First you equip your fishing rod and stand facing a body of water. Then you use the tool to cast your line. As you hold the tool down, a distance marker appears, showing exactly how far your cast is going to go. Releasing the tool will perform the cast. Once you've cast, all you need to do is focus on watching the bobber in the water. After a short amount of time, the bobber will move. If the fish just nibbles, the bobber will wiggle a bit and the water will ripple. If the fish bites down, the bobber will completely submerge and there will be a splash. You will need to press down the tool button shortly after the fish bites. If you press it down during a nibble, you will just pull the line from the water. So far, this is generally how most fishing works in games. But once you start reeling when a fish bites, things get a bit different. So your goal is to reel the fish all the way up to shore and tire it out enough to catch it. As you reel, the fish comes closer toward you. Every so often, the fish will begin to struggle and fight back. At this point, the end of the line turns red and you'll need to stop reeling or else risk breaking the line. After a moment, the fish will calm down and you can continue reeling it in. If you don't reel at all, the fish will swim around and the line will turn blue. Shortly after that, the fish will escape off of the hook. So basically there's a balance of reeling and not reeling that you'll need to do in order to catch a fish. Once you get the fish close enough to shore and it's tired enough, you'll instantly pull the fish out of the water and catch it. Fish come in different types and weight ranges. I've included a special attribute for weight on items that require it, which can now be seen next to the item's name in the inventory. So far I've added 5 or 6 different fish to catch, but I've planned at least 100 different fish in total. An interesting thing about fish is that they have different weight ranges and different amounts of fight. You can actually get a good idea of what sort of fish you have hooked the moment you start reeling it in or fighting it. A heavy fish will take more effort to reel in, and a fish with more fight will pull more aggressively at the line. The end result is what I'm hoping will feel like a more realistic and interesting fishing experience. I plan to add the ability to equip different bait and lures to the rod as well, but for now that isn't super important for this initial phase of the development, so I'll have to get around to that later. One last thing to mention about fishing is that it works a lot like bug catching in the sense that you'll be able to catch different fish based on the time of day, season, weather, and location. In order to not make this a huge headache where you need to pull up a wiki in order to figure out where fish are, I'm going to add a way for you to discover when and where fish can be found, and keep that as a note in your game journal. This way, if you need to find, say, a catfish, you can just pull up your journal, and if you've uncovered information about catfish, it will display it there for you so you know where and when to find them. Moving on to something entirely different, I took on the task of setting up a system for clothing which allows me to easily add different clothing color variations without needing to generate thousands of additional sprite sheets. I'm using the same system I put into place for player colors by swapping out the colors in the sprites at runtime based on predefined colors. Much like with the new weight property on an item, I've created a color property which also displays next to the item's name in the inventory. One thing about this system that was actually kind of a hassle was that I not only had to change the colors of the clothing the player was wearing, but also make sure the colors of the clothing items were changed as well. That might seem obvious, but it was actually a bit trickier as I now needed to accommodate color changing in items through all of their various implementations. There's obviously the item being shown in the inventory, but I also needed to modify the item when it's on the ground and also when it's being carried. Finally, I had a different method of displaying an item when you lift it in the inventory, so I had to make sure the colors updated there as well. The end result is there are now 32 color options for every piece of clothing. I could have went with a system to allow for thousands of colors, but this creates an issue where there's just too many choices and they can have a negative impact on the game. If I find out there really needs to be more colors, I can always add them in later. While I'm talking about items, I want to briefly touch on the fact that I did a major overhaul to how items are being stored. Basically, I was storing each item as a scriptable object, which was great, but I needed to also create a scriptable object for an item slot. The difference between an item and an item slot is basically all of the custom values, like item quantity, quality, etc., were all being stored in a bunch of separate values. The item slot scriptable object allows me to just stick all of that into one place, so I can more easily and quickly move items around via script and do comparisons and all other sorts of things. Things such as adding the weight property or the color property to items was requiring that I go in and change hundreds of lines of code to accommodate for additional values stored in each item. I've since went and changed hundreds of lines of code, hopefully for the last time when it comes to adding new item properties. This was probably one of the scarier changes I've had to make to the game itself, because changing up how items are stored resulted in creating thousands of errors across dozens of scripts. I spent 10 hours straight just fixing all of the errors to get the new system working. I literally did not stop working on it for 10 hours, not to drink or eat or stretch or anything, because I feared if I stopped working, I'd come back to a huge mess and it would be much harder for me to get back into fixing things. I wouldn't recommend this way of working, but unfortunately for me, it's the best way for me to get things done, because what took me 10 hours could have ended up taking me several days if I had took a lot of breaks. Anyone who has done a lot of programming before can definitely understand how even being distracted for 5 minutes while in the zone can put you completely out of your groove and make you lose hours of productive time. But I'm happy to say all of the errors are fixed, the system works great, and it's going to be much easier for me to add new item properties and deal with items via script in the future. I'm sure I'm not done adding item properties either. I can already think of a couple I'll probably end up having to add at some point. That's all for this video. There's still a lot for me to cover, so I'll try to get the next devlog out relatively soon. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Everyone's support means a lot to me and pushes me to work even harder. As always, thanks for watching.